My grandfather died on a Tuesday morning in March, and by noon, my stepmother was already scrolling through real estate listings on her phone in the funeral home's family waiting room. I watched her do it. I was sitting across from her with a paper cup of cold coffee, still wearing the same jeans I'd slept in the night before, and she was pinching her fingers to zoom in on a condo listing in Muskoka. She didn't know I could see her screen. Or maybe she didn't care. That was the same morning I found out my grandfather had left everything. His home on Ramsey Lake, his savings, and all 4 McAllister home and build locations across northern Ontario, worth just over $9 million to my father. Every cent, every key, every supplier contract and loyal customer account that my grandfather had built from the back of a pickup truck over 40 years. And 3 days later, at the will reading, my father looked at me across the long table at the lawyer's office and said, quietly and without much feeling, "The estate is mine now. You have no claim here." He thought that was the end of it. It wasn't, because there was something buried inside that will, something my grandfather had placed there quietly, like a fuse tucked beneath the floorboards, and my father had just lit it without knowing it. To understand any of this, you need to understand where it started. My name is Cora. I'm 28 years old and I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. Northern Ontario is a strange and beautiful place. The rock is pink granite, the winters are relentless, and people look you in the eye when they shake your hand. My grandfather, Angus McAllister, embodied all of that. He started McAllister Home and Build with one store on LaSalle Boulevard in 1982, selling hardware and lumber to the miners and contractors and weekend reno warriors who made up most of Sudbury. By the time I was born, there were 4 locations: Sudbury, North Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, and Timmins, and he knew the name of every employee in every one of them. My father was the opposite. He had a business degree from Western. A condo in Toronto he preferred to the family house, and opinions about efficiency that my grandfather called spreadsheet nonsense. They fought constantly. My grandfather wanted to invest in people, maintain proper benefits, grow slowly. My father wanted to franchise, cut overhead, bring in outside investors. My grandfather said no every single time. I used to think I understood both sides. Then my mother got sick and I stopped understanding my father at all. I was 9 years old when she was diagnosed multiple sclerosis. It moved slowly at first and then very fast. She was in a wheelchair by the time I was 12, and she passed away 4 days before my 13th birthday. In the middle of February, when the snow in Sudbury was piled past the window ledges and the world felt like it had gone gray for good. My grandfather held my hand at the graveside. He wore his good wool coat, his eyes were red, and he didn't try to explain anything to me or tell me it would be fine. He just held my hand. That was enough. My father wore his Toronto coat, the slim-cut one that wasn't warm enough for Sudbury in February, and he stood slightly apart from the rest of us, his hands in his pockets. He checked his phone twice during the service. I saw him do it. I never forgot it. He remarried 14 months later. My stepmother was a financial consultant from Barrie, trim and precise, with opinions about everything and warmth for almost nothing. She moved into the family house in Sudbury, and within 6 months it didn't feel like a family house anymore. The photo of my mother that used to sit on the mantel ended up in the hallway closet. My mother's garden in the backyard, the one she'd spent 10 years coaxing into color, got torn out and replaced with low-maintenance ornamental grasses. Easier to maintain, my stepmother told me, as if that settled anything. My grandfather saw what was happening. He started inviting me to the store on weekends, letting me follow him around while he talked to staff, checked inventory, had long coffees with contractors who'd been buying from him for 20 years. When I was 15, he taught me how to read a balance sheet. When I was 17, he let me shadow the Timmins store manager for a full week during March break. When I graduated from Laurentian with a business degree at 22, he was in the front row, standing before anyone else, clapping until his hands were red. Congrats. Big day. Talk soon. He did not talk soon. My grandfather's health started declining when I was 26. His heart, mostly. He'd been managing it with medication for a few years, but the winters were harder on him, and the constant fighting with my father over the business was wearing him down in ways doctors couldn't fix. I moved back to Sudbury. I didn't think twice about it. I told my roommate in Toronto I was leaving, packed my Subaru with everything that mattered, and drove 5 hours north on the 400. My grandfather protested, said he didn't need a nurse. I told him I wasn't there as a nurse. I was there because Sudbury had better poutine and I'd missed the rocks. He laughed at that. He had a good laugh. For 14 months, I made his meals and drove him to his cardiology appointments at Health Sciences North and sat with him in his study, at the store when he wanted to go over the books. I helped him sort through 40 years of supplier agreements and employee records. I learned every corner of that business, not because he asked me to, but because it was his, and I loved him, and those two things had always been the same. My stepmother visited twice in those 14 months. My father came once in October and spent most of the visit on a phone call about the Sault Ste. Marie location's Q3 numbers. About 4 months before the end, my grandfather asked me to call his lawyer, a man named Mr. Renault, who had handled McAllister family affairs for nearly 20 years. He asked me to call after my father's usual Sunday evening phone call, once he was sure my father wasn't coming by. I need to make a change, my grandfather told me. His voice was raspier by then, but his eyes were clear, to the will. What kind of change? He smiled the way he used to when I'd figured out something clever at the store. A test, he said. I'm going to give your father exactly what he wants, and I'm going to give him exactly 48 hours to show me who he is. Mr. Renault came the next afternoon while my father was in Toronto. They spoke for 2 hours in the study with the door closed. When he left, he paused in the hallway and looked at me. Your grandfather is a very precise man, Mr. Renault said. You'd do well to trust that. I nodded. Whatever my grandfather had arranged, it was deliberate and careful, and that was all I needed to know. He passed away on a Tuesday in March. 6:40 in the morning. I was asleep in the leather chair beside his bed. The old one from his study that we'd moved in months ago, when neither of us could pretend anymore that he was walking down the hall on his own. I woke up to silence. The oxygen concentrator had stopped its rhythm. The room was still. I sat with him for a while before I called anyone. I held his hand and thanked him for everything. For the weekends at the store. For quietly funding my degree when he found out my father had refused to help. For just being the person in my life who never once made me feel like a burden. When I finally called my father, he answered after 4 rings, voice groggy. He's gone, I said. A pause. Okay. I'll drive up in the morning, call the hospital to have him pronounced. Don't touch anything in the study. The business documents are all in there. His father had just died, and he was worried about the documents. Okay, I said, and I hung up. The next 3 days were a blur of arrangements and casseroles, and people I hadn't seen in years coming through the door. My grandfather was well loved in Sudbury. Half the city owed him something. A job, a good deal, a referral, a kind word at the right moment. The funeral home was standing room only. My stepmother stood beside my father in the receiving line, wearing a black blazer that still had a dry cleaning tag on the inside of the sleeve. At one point, I heard her tell someone from the Rotary Club that the transition of the business will be handled very professionally. My grandfather wasn't even in the ground yet. At the graveside, my father leaned toward me. I thought, for just a second, that grief had finally found him. Will reading is tomorrow at 10, he said quietly. Mr. Renaud's office on Larch Street. Don't be late. We need to sort out the property transfer quickly. I'm listing the house. I froze. Listing it? It's too big, too expensive to heat. I'll liquidate and roll the assets into the restructuring. He straightened his coat. You'll need to find somewhere else. I'd start looking tonight if I were you. He walked away to speak to someone from the Chamber of Commerce. I stood at my grandfather's grave and thought about 48 hours. I thought about the test. That night I packed a bag. Not everything, just what I needed. My laptop, my good winter coat, the photo of my mother from the hallway closet where my stepmother had moved it years ago, a small framed picture of my grandfather and me standing in front of the original Sudbury store when I was 11, me in a hard hat 3 sizes too big, grinning like I'd just won the lottery. I put the bag in my Subaru and went to the will reading in the morning. Mr. Renaud's office smelled like old paper and coffee. My father sat at one end of the table, hands folded, looking confident. My stepmother sat beside him. I sat at the other end. The primary will was straightforward. The house on Ramsey Lake, all 4 McAllister locations, all business assets and accounts, to my father in full. Approximately $9.2 million CAD in total estimated value. My father exhaled slowly. He reached over and covered my stepmother's hand with his. She smiled. Is there anything further? My father asked. There is a sealed addendum, Mr. Renault said carefully. It is not to be read today. It becomes relevant only under specific circumstances. What circumstances? Those will become clear in 48 hours, Mr. Renault said. Or they won't. My father didn't ask more questions. He was already thinking about the restructuring. As we stood to leave, my father turned to me. He didn't look angry. He looked almost bored. The estate transfers to me. That includes the house. I need it empty by the end of the week. I have stagers coming Saturday. You can take your personal things, but anything that was your grandfather's stays. I've been living there for over a year, I said. Rent-free, he said. I think that's been quite generous already. He glanced at my stepmother. We need a clean break. I looked at him for a long time, waiting for something. Some trace of the man who was supposed to be my father. Some flicker. There was nothing there. My stepmother touched my arm lightly as they walked past. The kind of touch you give someone you're dismissing without a scene. You're young, she said. You'll land on your feet. She said it exactly the way you'd say it to a stray cat. I drove back to the house and walked through every room one last time. I stood in my grandfather's study, looked at his desk, his bookshelves, the aerial photograph of the La Salle store that had hung on that wall since before I was born. I took nothing that wasn't mine. I locked the back door with my key, then dropped it through the mail slot because he had asked for a clean break, and I was going to give him exactly that. I drove to the Tim Hortons on Regent Street. It's open 24 hours. I ordered a medium double-double and parked in the far corner of the lot under a light. It was 8 degrees outside. My car heater works fine, but I was rationing gas. I had $340 in my checking account. My RRSPs held a bit more, but that money was locked. I had a tank and a half of gas, a double-double, and a secret worth $9 million. I watched the clock on the dashboard. 9 p.m., 2 a.m. I thought about my father folding his hands at that table. I thought about my stepmother scrolling condo listings at the funeral home. I thought about every Sunday dinner I'd cooked for my grandfather. While my father called from Toronto to argue about supplier margins, I thought about my mother's garden, torn out for ornamental grass that nobody loved. I did not cry. I was too tired and too cold and too certain of something I couldn't prove yet. 4 a.m., 7:30. I bought another coffee. I used the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face and looked in the mirror. I looked like someone who had slept in a Subaru in a Tim Hortons parking lot in Sudbury in March, which is exactly what I was. 8:55 a.m., I drove to the end of Ramsey Lake Road and parked where I could see the gate. I checked my phone. No calls from my father, no texts. 9 a.m. My phone rang, Mr. Renault. Cora! His voice was careful and deliberate. Did your father contact you at any point in the last 48 hours to offer you accommodation or financial support? No, I said nothing. A long exhale. Then the addendum is triggered. As of this moment, the primary bequest to your father is voided. The estate, the house, the business assets, all accounts transfers to you. The paperwork was filed electronically at 9 o'clock. I gripped the steering wheel. He doesn't know yet. I've asked him to come to my office at 10 to finalize what he believes are the deed transfers to himself, Mr. Renault said. I suggest you come as well. I've also arranged for a property manager, a retired OPP officer named Mr. DeVoe, to meet you at the house first. Your grandfather was very thorough. I sat in the car for a moment after I hung up. A crow landed on the fence post at the end of the drive and looked at me and flew away. I started the engine. Mr. DeVoe met me at the gate with a court order and the quiet efficiency of a man who had handled difficult situations for 30 years. The locks hadn't been changed yet. We walked in together. 40 minutes later, my father's Audi pulled up. He and my stepmother were mid-conversation when they came through the front door and saw me standing in the entryway. My father stopped walking. Why are you here? I live here, I said. The look on my stepmother's face when we arrived at Mr. Renaud's office and she understood what the addendum said. That is something I will keep with me for the rest of my life. It moved through stages, confusion, then disbelief, then a cold, furious calculation. My father's face did something different. It went blank first, then something cracked in it. This is invalid, he said. I'll contest it. There is a no contest provision, Mr. Renault said patiently. Challenging the will forfeits the personal trust your father set aside for you in the original estate. You would walk away with nothing at all. She knew, my stepmother said, her voice sharp. She was in on it. I called the lawyer when my grandfather asked me to, I said. I didn't know the terms. That was true. I had only trusted my grandfather, and he had been worth trusting. My stepmother stood up. I am not sitting here for this. She looked at my father, then looked away. She walked out. We listened to her heels on the tile, and then the office door, and then silence. My father sat there. He looked diminished somehow, smaller, like something had been quietly propping him up for years and it had been removed. She'll leave, he said. He didn't sound devastated. He sounded tired. When she realizes the money's gone, she'll leave. I know, I said. I don't have much outside the estate, he said. My Toronto mortgage is significant. The investment accounts aren't what they were. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just telling the truth, maybe for the first time in a long time, because there was no longer any reason to perform. My grandfather had told me once, near the end, that my father had been a frightened boy who became a frightened man and wrapped that fear in money until he couldn't feel anything else. He didn't say it with contempt. He said it the way you talk about a patient who refused the treatment that might have helped them. I'm not going to let you lose everything, I said. My father looked up. I'll set up a monthly transfer, enough for a reasonable apartment and basic expenses. Not much more than that. I held his gaze. You are not to come near the business, not the stores, not the staff, not the accounts. If I find out you've interfered, the transfers stop. He was quiet a long moment, calculating the way he always did. Then he nodded. He stood and picked up his coat. He was almost at the door when he stopped, still facing away from me. You turned out more like him than I thought, he said. Your grandfather. He walked out. I took over as CEO of McAllister Home and Build the following Monday. I drove to the flagship store on LaSalle Boulevard at 7 in the morning and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in. The sign out front, the one with my grandfather's hand-lettered logo, the same font he'd chosen in 1982, looked different to me now, heavier, mine in a way it had never been before. The store manager, Mrs. Tremblay, who had worked for my grandfather for 19 years, met me at the door and looked at me steadily. We heard, she said. The staff have questions. I'll answer them, I said. All of them. I spent that first week going to every location. Sudbury, North Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, Timmins. I wore steel-toed boots and walked the floors and asked questions and listened to the people who had kept these stores, running through every restructuring plan my father had floated. And every time my grandfather had quietly blocked it. I learned what they needed. I learned what had been promised and never delivered. I started delivering it. 6 months in, we won a supply contract for a new wing at Health Sciences North, the same hospital where my grandfather had spent so many of his final appointments. It felt right in a way I couldn't put into words. My stepmother left my father in April, as he had predicted. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in New Sudbury. I sent the monthly transfers. He cashed them without comment for the first 3 months. In June, he called me. First time he'd called without a specific logistical reason in longer than I could remember. I drove past the LaSalle store, he said. The parking lot was full on a Saturday. It usually is, I said. You changed the signage. Restored it, I said, back to the original font, the one Grandpa chose. A pause. It looks good. I asked if he wanted to get coffee. He said yes, but tentatively, like he wasn't sure he'd earned the offer. We met at a small place on Elgin Street and talked about the weather in the wolves season and the road construction on the 17. We did not talk about the money or the house or the will. There was too much there, and neither of us was ready to touch it. But he showed up, that mattered. He comes for dinner occasionally now. It is still awkward. We are still learning how to be in a room together without 40 years of avoidance pressing down on everything. But my grandfather believed in the possibility of people changing. He'd built an entire business on it, and I was not going to be the one to prove him wrong. I established the Angus McAllister Skilled Trades Bursary through Cambrian College last fall. It funds a full year of training in carpentry, electrical or plumbing for students who can't afford the program fees. 12 students in the first cohort, 12 people who are going to go build things. At the launch event, I stood at the front of a room full of people who had known my grandfather, and I said what I knew to be true, that he had taught me the difference between owning something and earning it. That the most valuable thing he left me wasn't in any account or on any deed. It was the understanding that you lead with your values, or you don't lead at all. After, I drove to the cemetery on the north end of the city, where the granite pushes up through the thin soil the way it does everywhere in Sudbury. The rock just below the surface, permanent and honest. I put a small hammer on my grandfather's headstone, the kind he always kept in his jacket pocket, worn smooth from use. I sat on the cold ground for a while and talked to him. I told him the stores were doing well. I told him Mrs. Tremblay had finally taken the assistant manager position he'd been trying to give her for 6 years. I told him the tulips in the back garden, at the house on Ramsey Lake, had come up beautifully this spring, even after everything. You were right, I told him. He failed the test, but I think he's trying to learn something from it. I don't know if it's enough, but it's something. The wind off the lake was cold, even in September. I pulled my coat tighter. I drove home along the lakeshore road, the water dark and flat, the birches on the far bank going gold. I pulled into the driveway of the house on Ramsey Lake and sat a moment before going inside. The lights I'd left on were warm in the windows. If you're watching this and you know what it feels like to be the one in the family that nobody fights for, the one who shows up and loves and takes care and still ends up treated like an inconvenience, I want you to know something. Your worth is not determined by whether the people who were supposed to love you could see it. Some people can't. Some people are so buried under their own fear and want that they cannot see what is right in front of them. That is their failure, not yours. My grandfather saw me when no one else bothered to look, and he spent 40 years quietly, making sure I would be okay even after he was gone. That kind of love doesn't disappear. It becomes the foundation you build on. Build something worth having. I promise it's possible.